Welcome to this session on mental health resilience. Now, the topic of mental health can be confusing and sometimes a scary topic to approach. But through these sessions, both internally at Scott Logic, but also as we present them externally in this fashion, we aim to discover how we can start to understand mental health better. And in this particular session, we're particularly interested in our stressors and how we respond to them so that we can plan healthier coping strategies and ultimately build a level of resilience that protects and supports our mental health well-being. So some objectives for this particular webinar. By the end of the session, what we're hoping to be able to achieve here is that we can define mental health resilience in some detail. We can understand stress and how it affects us, and ultimately define those stressors and how we can go about building resilience to deal with them. So a short introduction from me, and following on from what Rob said in his introduction to the webinar, I'm Laurence Pisani. I'm Head of Consultancy in our London office for Scott Logic. So I am responsible for and run all aspects of the consultancy service that we deliver from our London office, which includes our really great people that we have. And so what I bring as part of my passion for psychology and mental health as a topic, which has been something that I've had since my undergraduate studies in the subject, is a continued interest as a thread through my career in software engineering, specifically in human-computer interaction, which is my segue across into the IT space. But I've always stayed abreast of the field of psychology itself, and more latterly looking at things like cognitive behavioural therapy and its application as part of industrial psychology. So I like to employ the principles that I've learned and kind of cherished in my passion for psychology across my role as a head of consultancy. So it's all about creating trusted environments in which we empower people to talk about mental health safely, but also creating a supportive and informed people structure that means that we're alert and empathetic to mental health concerns and can signpost our people to the resources that they might need. I'm always happy to hear from people, to open discussion, or for people to find out more about what we're doing on this front at Scott Logic or in any of the areas of well-being. So I can be contacted via that email address, lawrence@scottlogic.com. And a short note about the kind of things I have advocated for in Scott Logic in terms of building out a strong well-being program. I've drawn attention to the fact that it's absolutely vital that we look at mental well-being as part of the wider well-being approach, and that any business really should, because the demands that are upon us in our industry in particular, they often create small-scale and dormant mental health issues. And if they go unchecked, then they have that propensity to grow into much larger problems, which can be quite severe for the individual, but obviously have severe effects for the business as well. So let's start by taking a look and talking a little bit about mental health, in particular how we define and construct the concepts that make up mental health resilience. So it's important to consider that mental health exists on a continuum. It's really rare for someone to achieve 100% perfect mental health status all of the time. We're always fluctuating between one extreme and the other, just as our moods can change from positive to negative. The tipping point, though, is when our negative emotions stop us from functioning in life, and when that happens for a significant amount of time. When we enter the mental distress end of the continuum, then our resolve is really tested, and it's through the building of resilience that we can cope with that distress and move ourselves back towards positive mental health. So resilience is best defined as the ability to adapt to or recover from a number of factors that elicit a stress response, such as adversity, failure, loss, trauma, all things that we all experience to some degree in our lives. These stress responses are also triggered by things like feelings of being overwhelmed, threats of danger, health problems, financial concerns. They're all things that we would expect to deal with in the course of our life, and we all deal and cope with them very differently. So building resilience is about allowing us to cope better. So let's look at some of those in a bit more detail. Now, trauma is an emotional response to a serious or traumatic event. And it's got both short and long-term response effects. So initial responses are things like shock, denial, other predictable responses in the moment. But there are longer-term responses that are less predictable, and they can be quite distressing, quite debilitating. They include things like feelings of powerlessness, severe anxiety. They're very common in the longer-term responses to trauma. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not just a facet of war. The stress that we carry with us after traumatic events is evident across the whole spectrum of traumatic experience. Mental burnout is particularly prevalent, and while it might not be a psychological diagnosis in its own right, it's a complex issue made up of various trigger factors that lead to burnout. And we see mental burnout occur when people are consistently overextending themselves, pushing the limits of what they're capable of and comfortable with, of coping with. And that occurs over a period of time. One such occurrence of mental burnout, though, has the propensity to cause a crash. And that can be quite severe, and it's actually very difficult to recover from. And so it's important that we get on a pathway, on a journey to understanding and recognizing some of the symptomatic elements of mental burnout before they occur. And any kind of conflict can cause stress. It heightens our response, it increases our cortisol levels, our stress hormones, as well as our adrenaline levels. So in building true resilience to conflict, it's actually about avoiding it and avoiding it safely. So seeking resolutions to situations as they arise without assumptions and misperceptions is the key approach here. What we want to avoid is the heightened response, but also the post-conflict hormone crash, where we come down very heavy on the other side of that particular situation, has the propensity to lead to low levels of quality in our mental health. But also what we talked about in the previous slide, where we're looking at ways of ensuring that we are moving away from those compound factors that deliver a stress that has the propensity to cause mental burnout. Now, we see some common elements when we look at all of these factors. Those were just some examples. There are far many more. But what we see across all of these areas and many more are a set of common elements or behavior traits. And it's this commonality across those elements that puts the burden on our mental health. And it has the propensity to break us down over time. This is particularly true if we're already vulnerable in some way. So, for example, if we're under other pressures, no matter how small they might be, there is a compound effect. There is a large effect on our mental health as we build up that profile of our stress. But there are also some positive common elements that can help us build mental health resilience. So developing resilience skills can help us recover from many of these situations. Building resilience can and does limit emotional damage that's caused by mental health triggers, by traumatic events, and by those compound effects that I refer to that cause burnout and general mental decline. If we look at some of these things on the screen, increasing self-awareness and the ability to self-review, the ability to self-check and to help ourselves is really important. Anticipating challenges and preparing for difficult situations before they arise means that we're mentally prepared. And then developing strategies to cope with those situations that we know we can't avoid or step aside from, so that we're prepared to be able to face the adverse situation. And then creating and maintaining positive social relationships, ensuring that we understand and recognize that we can't just do this on our own. So these are all things that we'll look at a little later in the session. So now that we've discussed what mental resilience is, let's focus in this section on our understanding of stress itself, including our responses to it. So stress is a fact of life. It's not always a bad thing or the result of a negative experience or situation. In fact, stress can help motivate us to develop positive coping strategies or find effective solutions to some of the problems that we're facing. It can be a positive force in our lives, but too much can have the opposite effect. We don't always get to choose the situations we find ourselves in, but usually we get to choose how we respond in the long run. And by recognizing our automatic, immediate, unplanned responses to stress and committing to building our own resilience, then we will support our overall success and ultimately our well-being. So taking the time to consider what our responses are to stressful situations, it gives us the opportunity to more effectively consider that response. It helps us consider what has worked, hasn't worked for us in the past, whether we've been too hard on ourselves in our assessment of how we've dealt with stressful situations, what support we need and from who should we build around us as our support network, but also how we balance that need for support with our own ability to assess and heal ourselves. So why is it important to recognize this automatic response to stress? Well, fundamentally, because it's a daily occurrence. We have a natural automatic response that tells us a lot about how we handle stressful situations. We tend to overlook the importance of understanding those reactions when we're looking to build out our resilience. We kind of get lost in the moment, and that's perfectly natural. But if on reflection, we start to take notice of these and consider the nature of how we respond to particular situations, then we can begin to understand the sources of stress and make ourselves more resilient to it. Also consider that by recognizing those automatic responses in those around us, then we can also start to better understand them. Allows us to adjust our behaviors and our responses accordingly, and it minimizes fractious situations from arising. We're more likely to be empathetic, compassionate, more likely to communicate better when we start to consider how someone else is dealing with a stressful situation. So by identifying your potential physical, behavioral, and emotional responses to stress before they happen, you increase your ability to recognize when you're having that stress response. This can enable you to reach out for help earlier. It may lessen the negative impact of stress on your work, on your home life, on your health in general. And some of the examples here are the kind of stress responses we might expect. And some of these are very familiar, maybe considered natural or in some cases insignificant in terms of how they play out across our normal day. However, when we see consistent, almost chronic stress response, especially in combination, then we should be increasing our self-awareness in order to find healthier ways of responding and dealing with it. So we'll look now at how we can go about choosing those healthier responses. There are many strategies that can help reduce the negative impact of stressors. And we'll look at a list on the next slide, which includes potential strategies to help prevent or manage stress. Now, many of these are evidence-based approaches, such as mindfulness, practicing gratitude, deep breathing. Others are practice-based approaches that have been shared by those over the years who use them successfully to manage their own life stressors. Now, not all of the strategies will work for everyone. In fact, some might even cause stress because they're not calming or enjoyable to you, but others also have the propensity to either be neither positive nor negative. So it's important to stay objective and to look at what would work for you in terms of your circumstance and the stress that you're dealing with. So by including healthier responses into your regular activities, you not only build up resilience, you may be able to alleviate the stress in many different situations. So choosing healthier strategies in times of personal stress is the aim here. Some of these strategies seem straightforward and obvious. You may already be doing some of these. Others you may want to consider as a way of shifting your behaviors towards healthier strategy, away from and therefore directly dealing with stress, and even some of the unhealthy strategies that we often employ to cope. So let's look at how we explore those stressors and what we can do to minimize their effect on our mental health by building resilience. As we discussed at the start, resilience is the ability to bounce back after being blindsided or overwhelmed by adversity. One of the ways to improve our ability to bounce back is to be really fully aware that challenging and difficult events could happen to any of us at any time, and to proactively consider how we might cope with those. Now, this isn't intended to increase anxiety about what could go wrong, but it's enabling us to recognize that many people have experienced these life events before us and have successfully moved forward with their lives. So, for example, most of us know individuals who have experienced serious illness, disability, or loss, but then bounce back to enjoy and appreciate life more than ever. We probably also know people who experienced a setback or a disappointment many years ago, perhaps, and yet they continue to experience anger or hurt about it every day. Our quality of life is directly affected by our ability to move forward from a crisis, moving forward in a way that supports our mental well-being in particular. So there are many causes of stress: money troubles, job issues, relationship conflicts, major life changes. But there are also smaller stressors, such as long daily commutes, rushed mornings, rushed meetings, increasing workloads. These all add up over time. Learning how to recognize those sources of stress in your life is the first step in managing them. And it's important that we try not to compare. Stress is inevitable, but it's not a competition. One stressor can sometimes overwhelm us, while at other times we can manage multiple stressors quite well. Whether you check off a few or many of those stressors that we looked at, they don't compare to anyone else's, because everyone's experiences, both past and present, are very different. And any or all of these could be a stressor at some point in your life. The intent here of identifying the stressors or the potential stressors in your life is to then build resilience, so we're better equipped to deal with them. So let's have a look at what options we have when considering how we manage our stress. So within stress management, we have choices when it comes to dealing with stress and adversity. And these choices can usually be classified as one of the 4 A's: accept, avoid, alter, and adapt. And it's important to recognize that the really valid choices we make by employing this strategy are those that can eliminate or significantly reduce our stress. So let's have a look at them in turn. So sometimes the things that stress us out are simply out with our control. And by recognizing that and adjusting our response such that we accept the situation for what it is, we can reduce our stress response. As it occurs, we learn to accept it before it triggers that stress response. So we can do this by a number of ways. Some of the common elements here are things like just talking with other people. Feelings are legitimate, even if they're frustrating, or if the frustrating situations that they are part of can't be changed. Discussing stressful situations with a friend or a trusted colleague who actively listens and understands is extremely helpful. We can practice positive self-talk, so we remove the negative thoughts that we tend to have that often feed off each other, and they create additional negative thoughts that kind of give us that spiral effect in terms of how we deal with a stressful situation. And positive self-talk can reduce stress, and mainly it's about maintaining some and helping to maintain some objectivity in the situation. We can learn from mistakes. It's really important that we understand that mistakes are inevitable, and they should be used as teachable moments, rather than creating feelings of self-loathing. Essentially, what we're doing here is putting the situation into perspective, using the mantra, "It is what it is." So it becomes less personal and less stressful. Looking at avoid, as stressful situations arise, we can choose to deflect or refocus. So choosing instead to focus on something that we consider positive. And we simply avoid the stressful situation or the trigger. We create a resilient, immediate response that protects us from engaging in that absorbing, stressful situation. So stress can be avoided by planning ahead, rearranging surroundings and carrying a lighter workload, for instance. And some of the approaches that we have here are really important, and reflecting on how they play out across all aspects of our life, not just in the workplace, but also at home and at play. We can take control. Taking control of stressful routine tasks, for instance, helps us to build confidence. So, for example, we can plan our route better to be able to ease the stress of traffic. But recognizing where we do have an element of control, we should be looking at bringing in some of these avoidance concepts so that we prepare ourselves to avoid the stress before it occurs. Quite simply, we should learn to say no. Most people have a lot of responsibility and very little spare time. And so saying no is a really powerful tool that we have in our armory And we should use it more to create strong boundaries and to preserve our well-being. And we should prioritize. Understanding and working through what we're trying to achieve really helps us put things into perspective. We all know that scratching an item off of a to-do list has a real feeling of accomplishment, and we should try and achieve that on a very regular basis. Fundamentally, what we're doing here is refocusing away from the stressful situation or the person or the behavior and towards something that's more positive for us. Looking at alter, now we typically have the power to consider and change the environment around us to create healthier conditions for us to exist in. So when stressful situations can't be avoided, behaviors, communication, and time management may be needed to be altered such that we can deal with that stress. So some of the approaches here are talking about the small issues as they arise. So ensuring that they don't snowball and turn into bigger problems. It's okay to ask others to consider a situation, consider a behavior, to consider how stressful that is for the people around them. However, it's really important to listen to others in that situation too, and understand their personal perceptions on stressful situations and their behaviors, and being empathetic as a group, as a connected group, is really important to ensure that you don't muster feelings of negative feelings of blame or anything like that within a team environment. Communicating openly is really important too. Honesty is always the best policy. When sharing feelings as well, I also make sure to extol the virtues of using statements that include the word I rather than you. And that again helps to negate any blame on anyone else in the surrounding area or as part of the stressful situation, and allows you to be able to communicate more openly and honestly. We can manage our time better, grouping similar tasks together that increases our efficiency. That results in a lessened stress response. And we should state our time limits in advance. So prior to engaging in long processes or conversations or situations, simply letting people know if time is limited. It avoids any hard feelings, and it sets expectations early and avoids that stressful situation. So by shifting your external environment in some way, we're reducing or at some stage eliminating the stressful situation and the response to it. And finally, looking at adapt. Adapting often involves changing expectations, which in turn lowers the stress levels. So approaches here include adjusting standards, so recognizing first and foremost that perfection is impossible. Striving for perfection can cause feelings of frustration and guilt. Adjusting our personal expectations can really reduce the stress around that. Reframing the issue, looking at situations from a different viewpoint is really helpful. For example, rather than being frustrated by a particular situation, take yourself to one side of it and reframe it. Have a consideration for how it looks from a different perspective. And looking at the bigger picture, figuring out if something truly matters to the extent that it's causing you this stress. Will it matter in a year? Will it matter in 5 years? Is a really important perspective to have on something. If it won't, then letting go of it can relieve the stress. We tend to get caught up in the detail and in the moment and in the immediacy of things. Stepping back to put things in perspective is a really critical tool in managing stress. Ultimately, by employing this strategy, we're changing the way we think about or interact with the source of stress in our life. Now, looking at balancing our support network, it's almost impossible to think that we can deal with all of life's stressors on our own. It's really important that we consider that the need is there for us to bring those around us into the solution for stressful situations. Truly building resilience involves acknowledging that we need to connect and support each other. Now, without that, working in isolation, we only have a certain capacity or capability to deal with all of the stressors that life throws at us. Once we have connectivity, we can really get on a path to truly dealing with all of stressful situations in life. So consider, how do you feel after you help someone? If you're happy to help others and feel good doing it, do you also feel good about asking for help? If not, why not? Some of us were raised to believe that helping others was a sign of strength, but asking for help was one of weakness. But do you actually think that people who ask for help are weak? Probably not. Resilience involves our need to connect with each other. All of us will have times when we can offer help and times when we should reach out for help. There are times we need to be supported and times when we need to be supportive. Asking for help in our personal and our work lives is one of the ways that we can improve our resilience, and with some really immediate effects as well. And it's really important that we commit to our mental health. Our resilience is really low when our psychological effort outweighs our activities to replenish and restore our mental health. So just as we would address our physical health, the depletion of our physical energy and the capacity that we have to physically respond to the world around us, we have to also consider that we need to attend and commit to our mental health with equal importance. So consider the options that we've discussed that are available to you. Employing active coping strategies is a psychological or behavioural response to a stressor that changes the nature of it, or at the very least, our response to it. By planning our coping strategies based on what we learn about our stressors and our automatic responses, we can avoid those compound mental health effects that we talked about, all the dependency on avoidant activities that have the propensity to damage our mental well-being, such as substance misuse, gambling, all of those things that cause us to spiral. And finally, resilience isn't just about protecting us from harm. It's a powerful tool that can help us overcome and learn from all of our challenges. Ultimately, building resilience empowers us to cope and to grow. So to end, I'd like to make reference to some really useful resources, all of which we encourage our people at Scott Logic to make use of, to increase their knowledge, to ensure they're informed, but also their awareness of mental health issues, but also to be able to support each other through building empathetic and trusting environments in which we operate, and in which mental health isn't a taboo or a prejudged or a stigmatized subject. So I encourage you to seek out these and many other similar resources that are available to us, and find out how perspectives and perceptions around mental health are changing and are being supported across industry and beyond. So thank you very much for attending and allowing me and Scott Logic to share our understanding and experiences of mental health with you. I hope that you found even a small part of what I've talked about today useful. If you'd like to learn more about Scott Logic and what we're doing as part of our wellbeing program, then you can absolutely get in touch with me via the email address lawrence@scottlogic.com. Also look out for our hashtag, as Rob mentioned, look up from lockdown, where we're talking about what's important to us and our people as we transition back to the post-pandemic world. And this webinar will be recorded and will be put onto our YouTube channel so that you can look at that and share that as you see fit in the future. So thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.